"Uncle, please eat in the garage. The main table is full." That was the moment. Not the worst moment of my life. I've lived through war, lost my wife to illness, buried friends and brothers. But this was different. This cut not through flesh, but through the quiet dignity I had carried all my life. The words were spoken casually, as if logistics, as if seating charts mattered more than blood. It wasn't the first wound. Years ago, when I handed my nephew Marcus a check, the first investment that saved him from losing the land, he wept like a child. Back then, I was his second father. He used to say, "I owe everything to you." And I told him gently, "You owe me nothing. Just build something good." I didn't ask for anything in return. I never do. But months passed, then years. The calls slowed. The invitations stopped. Until this one came. A white envelope. Formal. Cold. "No, dear Uncle Walter. No warmth, no memory. Just, you're invited to a private estate dinner hosted by Marcus Granger, CEO of Granger Estates. Formal attire required." Not even a signature in his hand, just a printed name. As if I were a guest. Not the man who bought the first stone of that estate. Not the man who believed in him when no bank would. Still, I placed the invitation on the table, stared at it for a while, and chose to go. Not out of hope, not out of pride, but to remind myself who I still was, whether they saw it or not. I pressed my only suit, one that had seen weddings and funerals, success and silence. I polished my shoes, not because anyone would notice, but because I would. I still had my standards, even when the world tried to shrink me into the background. The drive to the estate was long. Trees lined both sides of the road like silent judges. The gates, when they opened, revealed a mansion sprawling like a kingdom. Designed, landscaped, curated for photographs, and for forgetting where it all began. I parked where the staff directed me, not among the other guests, but near the side entrance beside the maintenance shed. The irony didn't sting, it burned, but I held my breath, adjusted my collar, and stepped out into a place that might have my fingerprints in its foundation, but no longer carried my name. The evening air was cool. The scent of wine and trimmed lavender drifted through the courtyard. Laughter floated in the distance, and there I was, the forgotten root beneath a tree that now cast its own arrogant shade. Still I walked forward, not to reclaim, not to confront, but because sometimes presence is louder than protest. Friends, let me take a quick pause. Would you mind sharing in the comments? Where are you listening from? And have you ever experienced something like this? A moment where someone you helped suddenly made you feel like a stranger? If this story touches you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone. That small action helps us grow this channel and keep stories like this alive. Now, let's continue. The laughter led me toward the terrace. I saw them before they saw me. The long wooden table set beneath string lights that flickered like fireflies, linen napkins, fine wine, and waiters moving with rehearsed elegance. At the head of the table, Marcus sat in a tailored navy suit, surrounded by investors, friends, and strangers who would raise glasses in his name before dessert. No one stood when I arrived. No one waved. It was the estate manager who finally noticed me. A young man with polished shoes and a clipboard pressed to his chest. He glanced at me, then at his list, and then back at me again as if trying to solve a minor logistical error. "Sir," he said, walking briskly toward me, lowering his voice like I was a guest who had wandered in from the wrong neighborhood. "I believe your setting is arranged in the garage, around the side." He gestured politely but firmly toward the service path. I didn't blink, didn't flinch, just nodded. Some guests turned their heads, watching, not maliciously, but curiously, as if wondering who I was. I caught snippets. "Do you know him? Maybe he's part of the staff." Strange that he came alone. I turned and walked. Gravel crunched beneath my shoes. That same gravel I helped lay decades ago when this was nothing but an unfinished plot, with dreams bigger than its footprint. The garage wasn't dirty, but it was still a garage. One folding table, one chair, a plate covered with foil, a bottle of water, a napkin. No view of the vineyard, no candlelight, only the faint smell of gasoline and distance. I sat. The chair creaked beneath me, and the table was cold to the touch. I removed the foil and saw the same meal being served on the terrace. Just colder, just lonelier. I didn't eat at first. I just looked at the hands resting in my lap. Hands with calluses softened over time. Hands that had built fences and poured cement. That signed papers others couldn't afford to sign. That once wiped my nephew's tears after his father's funeral. And now, these hands belonged to the man who sat alone beside a lawnmower. The estate buzzed just yards away, like a celebration in a distant country. I could hear toasts being raised, silverware against glass, music swelling beneath polite laughter. But here, in this concrete room lit by a flickering bulb, silence told a different story. Not the story of exclusion, but of quiet recognition that sometimes the more you've given, the easier it is to be erased. And yet I stayed seated, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because even in a garage I carried more grace than the whole glittering table combined. The laughter from the terrace had rhythm now, a steady cadence of voices rising and falling in waves, like a tide I no longer belonged to. Toasts rang out. Chairs scraped gently. Someone made a joke that sent the whole table into a roar. That sound, it had once been mine. Years ago, when dinners were simpler, when we shared stories over chipped mugs and homemade stew, before fine wine replaced gratitude. Now I sat alone in a garage. The table before me was a fold-out, the kind used at bake sales or yard-work luncheons. The plate was hot to the touch, the food hastily microwaved, steak, potatoes, greens, all carefully prepared in the kitchen, and then abandoned here like a forgotten parcel. Next to it, a bottle of water with no glass, a single plastic fork, slightly bent, the kind you use once and never think about again. It matched the tone of the evening perfectly. I looked around. On the wall beside me, a rack of tools, some polished, some rusting, a worn-out hose, an old tire leaning against the cabinet, a dusty blanket draped over what might have once been a lawn chair. Every object had a use. Every inch of this space told a story of labor, of things fixed, trimmed, built. It was honest in a way the terrace could never be. But it was not a place you invite someone to eat. And yet, here I was. I lifted the fork, took a bite. The meat was seasoned, tender. Whoever cooked it knew what they were doing. But the warmth faded quickly in a room so quiet, so stripped of joy. I chewed slowly, staring at the concrete floor. Every so often, a gust of wind slipped under the garage door and stirred the edge of the blanket. It brought with it the faint scent of lavender and burning wood from the fireplace out on the terrace. I imagined the view they had, the vineyard stretching over the hills, the candles flickering on long white tablecloths, the glint of wine glasses raised in cheer. No one had come to check on me. No one had said my name. I was both too much to confront and too easy to forget. But I didn't leave. I didn't storm out or make a scene. I'd spent my life learning that dignity isn't proven in loud moments. It's in staying still, even when the world moves on without you. It's in lifting the fork, even when the room is cold and the chair wobbles beneath you. As I ate in silence, I thought of all the meals I had once served, to Marcus, to his mother, to guests we welcomed when we had only 2 chairs and a folding table. I thought of the nights I went without so he could have more. And now, years later, I had everything I had earned, except a place at his table. But what he didn't know, what they all didn't know, was this. I never needed their table to feel full. The laughter had shifted now, not careless anymore, but purposeful, the kind that comes after the clinking of glasses, when people are halfway through their wine and their words loosen into sentiment. From the terrace I could hear the rise of a toast, the telltale sound of a fork striking crystal, then silence. That hush that means a name is about to be spoken, a story, an acknowledgement. I paused mid-bite. The plastic fork trembled just slightly in my hand. Marcus's voice rang out, clear, controlled, coated in charm. "I want to take a moment," he said, "to honor those who made all of this possible." A murmur of agreement. Someone said, "Yes, yes," softly in the background. He went on, names of investors, old colleagues, a high school teacher who once encouraged him to think big. My mother, of course, he added with a chuckle that drew warm smiles. She always believed in me. They clapped. I sat in the garage, still, listening, holding breath in the shape of my name, but it never came. No Walter. No my uncle. No, the man who gave me my first check when the banks all said no. No mention of the nights we spent drafting blueprints in his parents' basement, or the day I drove hours to co-sign the deed that bought this land. They celebrated those who helped build the dream, but the man who signed the first cornerstone sat alone by a workbench eating microwaved steak. The applause roared. I heard wine poured again. I imagined shoulders being touched, hands being shaken, eyes lit up with gratitude, all turned in the wrong direction, all praising a version of history they chose to remember, one where I did not exist. But I was there, before the vines, before the walls, before Marcus believed in himself. I remembered when he came to me, a trembling young man with debt in his eyes and desperation in his voice. He didn't want charity, he wanted a chance, and I gave it to him, quietly, without conditions, without pride. I didn't ask to be on the deed, didn't ask for recognition, just told him to build something good and stay humble. Now they toasted vision and entrepreneurship, words that never felt heavier. I looked around the garage again, my chair, my plate, my plastic fork, a single napkin folded too neatly, as if that made the gesture feel respectable. But it didn't. It only made it lonelier. There's a unique pain in being erased not by strangers, but by those who know exactly who you are and choose to forget. Still, I didn't stand. I didn't walk out, because deep down I knew silence may bruise the ego, but it can't touch the truth. And the truth was this. Every stone in that estate, every grape in that vineyard, every brick laid in that home had one invisible thread running through it, my signature. Even if they never said my name, the house knew who I was. The fork rested on the now empty plate. I didn't remember eating the last few bites. My hands were still folded gently on the table, fingertips stained faintly from work long past. As I looked down at them, calloused and time-worn, the memories rose like dust in a sunbeam, quiet, weightless, but everywhere. These hands had built more than just homes. They'd steadied ladders in the wind, turned rusted bolts in the rain, folded letters with trembling hope, and once held the trembling hands of a boy named Marcus after his father's funeral. He couldn't have been more than 9 when I first let him come to the job site. He insisted on carrying my toolbox, even though it was too heavy for his thin frame. I remember how he beamed when I said he was strong. I taught him how to calculate lumber costs on a napkin, how to shake hands with your eyes, how to treat workers not like machines, but like men with stories, how to never pay late, because a man's dignity is often buried in an unpaid invoice. And I remember his eyes, wide, eager, full of fire. He'd sit in my truck and ask about concrete and credit, about clients, about risk. I let him shadow meetings, watch how you explain delays without losing trust. I paid for his night classes when he said he didn't want to be just a laborer. He wanted to lead. I believed him. I believed in him. And later, when his idea took form, this idea for a boutique estate, a vineyard that blended tradition with modern luxury, I was his first check. No paperwork, no contracts, just family. He said, "I'll make it back to you 100 times over." But what he gave back was silence, a plastic fork, a chair in a garage that still smelled like old oil and forgotten summers. I leaned back and looked at the rafters. Cobwebs curled in the corners. A dusty broom leaned against the wall. The floor was clean but untouched, no signs of recent work. This space wasn't for building anymore. It was just storage now, a place to keep things that had served their purpose. Was that what I had become? A memory stored in the quiet? The tools on the wall reminded me of long days under the sun, when the reward for a job well done wasn't applause, but the look of relief in someone's face when the roof no longer leaked. When Marcus once said, "Uncle Walt, I want to do this like you someday," he had done it, but not like me. He'd done it without the memory of where he came from, and now his guests dined with gold-rimmed glasses under chandeliers, while I sat with my thoughts, surrounded by relics of the very work that had made those chandeliers possible. The dust swirled slightly in the light streaming through the garage window, and as I stared at my hands, I realized something. You can wipe away fingerprints from glass, you can erase names from toast, but you can't hide the foundation under your feet. And whether they remembered or not, I was still part of this house's bones. I don't know how long I sat there. The sun had dipped just enough for the shadows in the garage to grow longer, stretching toward me like quiet reminders of things left unsaid. The laughter on the terrace had softened now, morphing into the gentle murmur of dessert and full bellies, the time of evening when people start leaning back, sipping slower, feeling content. I was still seated in that folding chair, hands resting in my lap, when I heard footsteps approach. They were brisk, purposeful, the kind of walk someone makes when they're about to fix something out of place. A young man, not much older than Marcus had been when I first handed him a set of blueprints, appeared in the open frame of the garage door. He wore a neatly pressed uniform with the estate's logo on his shirt. I don't think he even looked me in the eye at first, just surveyed the plate on the table, the plastic fork, the empty bottle of water, and me, an old man in a chair that didn't match the evening's dress code. He hesitated, then cleared his throat in that practiced way people do when they're trying to be polite while asking you to leave. "Sir," he said, his voice firm but trained to sound gentle, "this area is actually for staff. Guests are supposed to remain on the main terrace. I'm going to have to ask you to step out, please." I looked up at him. He didn't recognize me. Of course he didn't. To him, I was just someone who wandered in from the road, maybe a distant neighbor, maybe someone confused, a harmless intrusion, a wrinkle in a perfect evening. He waited. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't tell him that my name, my signature, was the first one that ever touched the blueprints for this estate, that the foundation had been poured with money I lent before Marcus had even secured a bank meeting, that the vineyards were irrigated with a system I'd designed myself, back when the land was still just weeds and stubborn clay. I didn't say any of that. I just nodded, slowly, with the kind of calm that only years of disappointment can teach. Then I stood. My knees cracked the way they always do now, but I straightened my back and lifted my head. I left the plate where it was. I didn't wipe the crumbs. I didn't fold the napkin. Some part of me wanted it to remain exactly as it was. Evidence, proof that I had been there, if anyone ever chose to notice. As I stepped outside, the air was cooler than I expected. The sky above the estate glowed with that deep violet of early evening, and the fairy lights from the terrace blinked in the distance like stars pretending to be dreams. No one called after me. No one saw me go. The driveway crunched beneath my shoes as I walked toward the old truck I still drove. It was parked at the bottom of the hill, far from the guest lot, in the gravel space reserved for vendors and delivery men. I unlocked the door, sat behind the wheel. For a moment I rested my hand on the ignition, but didn't turn it. The engine didn't hum. The radio didn't play. Only the sound of wind brushing through the trees and the clinking of cutlery in the distance carried across the vineyard like a song I used to know. Then, just once, I looked back, at the estate, at the rows of vines, the glowing windows, the laughter still echoing in a house I helped raise, and I knew they could keep their terrace, their speeches, their candles and curated menus, but tonight they lost something far more valuable than a place setting. They lost the man who gave them a beginning, and I took my name with me. The gravel shifted beneath my feet with every slow step I took down that long, winding driveway, a path I once helped pave, literally. I remembered the summer we laid it. Marcus wanted something grand, something that would impress investors the moment their tires touched it. We couldn't afford professionals then, so I brought my old crew out of retirement, and we did it by hand. Poured, pressed, sealed, inch by inch. The same hands that just moments ago had lifted a plastic fork had once pressed this very ground flat. And now, those same hands were letting go. I didn't rush, not because I was tired, but because something in me knew. This was the kind of walk that wasn't just about distance. It was about memory, about dignity, about reclaiming something that had been quietly taken over the years. Each step was a goodbye, not to the land, but to the version of myself who still hoped for acknowledgement, not to the house, but to the illusion that blood always remembers what built it. The laughter behind me faded into a soft hum, like the end of a song that no longer stirred anything in the heart. The closer I got to the road, the louder other sounds became. The breeze moving through the cypress trees, the crunch of tiny stones, the steady rhythm of my own footsteps. I passed the front lawn, the one I helped level when Marcus didn't trust the landscaper, past the porch lights, the ones I wired myself because the electrician quit last minute, past the oak tree we planted the day he signed his first land deed. We'd shaken hands under it like real men. "I'll never forget this," he said. But he had. And the truth is, I didn't need to remind him anymore, because I remembered, and that was enough. By the time I reached my truck, the sky had shifted fully into dusk. The estate behind me was glowing, golden, warm. A picture-perfect evening. But pictures lie. Pictures don't show the man eating alone in the garage. They don't show the silence around his name. They don't show the moment he chooses to leave. Not because he's angry, but because he finally knows what he's worth. I opened the truck door and paused. One last time, I looked back. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. Because here's what they'll never understand. You can be written out of speeches. You can be seated beside rakes and rust. But a man's value isn't granted by a chair at the table. It's defined by what he built, and how quietly he walked away when he knew he was no longer seen. I didn't drive off in haste. I just started the engine, rolled down the window, and let the evening air carry me forward. And with every turn of the wheels down that country road, I wasn't leaving something behind. I was carrying something home. The house greeted me not with grandeur, but with truth. Old wood, soft light, the quiet hum of a life lived in humility. My boots echoed faintly against the floor as I walked in, the sound familiar, steady. No chandeliers here, no catered courses, no polished speeches, just walls that had heard everything and remembered. I didn't take off my coat, didn't sit. I went straight to the cabinet in the hallway, the one with the worn brass handle and the drawer that always sticks unless you pull it just right. It opened with a reluctant groan. Inside, folders, yellowed at the edges. Some held old tax records, letters from my wife before we were married, drawings Marcus had made when he was 6 and dreamed of building tree houses. But behind them all, at the very back, the folder. Dark green, thick, tied with a brittle string, the kind that frays when touched too roughly. I laid it on the table, untied it slowly. Inside, the papers that had never left my care. Not because I wanted control, but because trust isn't a contract. It's a promise, protected by memory and guarded by silence. The original partnership deed, the estate's founding agreement, the initial investment breakdown, signed by my hand. And at the bottom, the most important page, the signature line. One line, still blank, still mine. They had asked for it many times, politely at first, then indirectly, then with impatience. The lawyers worded it as a formality. The family called it just a gesture. But I had always told them, when the time is right, I'll sign. But the time never came, because somewhere along the way they forgot who had held them steady when the earth shook. Tonight proved it. I ran my fingers along the edge of the page, not with anger, but with something heavier, a quiet grief. Not because I hadn't been thanked, but because what we once built with hands and heart had become hollow. And now they had their wine, their table, their view, but not my name, not my signature, because dignity isn't earned in moments of celebration. It's revealed in how you treat the people who helped you get there, and I had been fed in the garage. Now I placed the folder back inside, gently, retied the string, closed the drawer, and this time it didn't stick, it slid shut with ease, like something had finally found its place. The next morning passed like any other, coffee brewing in the kitchen, a soft breeze coming through the window above the sink, birds calling to one another from the trees outside, a day that seemed ordinary, peaceful, slow. but there was something underneath it all, like the silence after a storm before someone dares to speak of what was lost. Around noon, the phone rang. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. There was only one person who'd call at that hour after that dinner, and not for kindness, not for reconciliation. I let it ring. It rang again, a few minutes later. Again after that, this time longer. A voice message followed, but I didn't press play. I didn't need to, because I already knew the tone, that careful, businesslike urgency. The same voice that had once said, "I owe everything to you," now likely saying, "Hey, uncle," about that signature. The notary's ready. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm sorry about the garage." Not, "Did you get home safely?" Just the contract. Just the ink. He hadn't called when the first brick of that house was laid. He hadn't called when his father, my brother, died, and I raised him as my own. He hadn't called when the paperwork was filed, when the expansion was approved, when the title changed hands. But now, with money on the line, now he remembered I existed. I stared at the phone, watched the screen go black, watched the silence return to the room, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no ache from it, because there's a kind of silence that wounds, the silence of being forgotten. And there's a kind of silence that heals, the silence of choosing not to answer what no longer deserves a reply. I got up, walked outside, and let the wind hit my face. It smelled like cut grass and earth, like home. And somewhere inside the drawer, tucked beneath all those yellowed pages and faded documents, the signature line still waited. Still blank, still powerful, still mine. And suddenly, I understood the deepest kind of freedom isn't walking away from the table. It's not even answering when they ask you back, but only because they want your name, not your presence. Time has its own way of sharpening echoes. What is ignored one day becomes a whisper the next, and sometimes that whisper grows louder than any voice in the room. A week passed, then another, and still I said nothing. No returned calls, no emails, no signatures, but my silence, it began to speak for me. It started as a murmur, a quiet ripple in a polished office miles from my home, a delay here, a nervous check-in there. Then questions, hushed but urgent. Has the final authorization come through? What's the holdup? Why isn't the paperwork complete? I didn't need to be in that room to feel the tension building inside it. I imagined my nephew sitting at the head of a long table, his eyes darting toward his legal team, toward the investors, all of whom had been promised certainty. They had seen the estate. They had tasted the wine, walked the vineyard, shaken his hand. But none of them had looked into the garage. None of them had seen where they seated the man whose name they still needed. And now that name had gone quiet. I could feel the irony in every breath I took that week. How a man who had been made to feel invisible suddenly became unavoidable. Not because he demanded to be seen, but because without his presence, their future remained suspended in air. No press release would move the deal forward. No title or smile or catered promise could bypass a single blank space on that document. That one signature, still mine. And yet I didn't refuse them out of spite. It wasn't revenge I was sitting with. It was clarity. Because all those years ago, when I gave them that seed money, when I taught him how to pour concrete and read numbers, when I watched him rise, I never asked for a return, never asked for praise, just respect, a seat, a name remembered when the glasses were raised. But now that they only saw the value of what I had, not the value of who I was, I owed them nothing. It was strange how peaceful it felt, to know you are needed but not moved by neediness, to feel your absence echo louder than your presence ever did. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one that stays quiet, and mine finally was being heard. The knock on the door came early in the morning, not the hesitant tap of a courier, not the rush of a salesman, but the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone rehearsing every word on the porch before saying it aloud. I opened the door, and there he stood, my nephew, wearing a suit that probably cost more than the truck I used to haul lumber in my younger years, his hair neatly styled, his expression disheveled, not in appearance, but in conscience. He gave a weak smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes, and offered a greeting like we were old friends, simply out of touch. He began talking right away, without pause, like if he could string enough words together, maybe none of them would land too hard. "Uncle, about the dinner. There was some miscommunication. I didn't mean for you to be placed out there. It was an organizational mix-up. You know how these events go. No one meant any harm. I hope you didn't take it personally." But I did take it personally. And what's more, I took it clearly. Because it hadn't been a mix-up. Not really. It had been a decision. A quiet one. The kind made with a nod from someone who thinks legacy can be reduced to logistics. The kind where an older man in worn shoes is seated far enough from crystal glasses so the difference doesn't show. I didn't speak right away. I let silence be the judge, because in his eyes, I saw it. The discomfort of a man who suddenly realized the power he had dismissed. Not financial power, not legal, but the kind of power that comes from being rooted, not borrowed. He kept talking, apologies dressed in explanations, explanations cloaked in excuses, but I wasn't looking at his words anymore. I was looking at the man, and I wasn't angry. I was done being angry. What I felt was older than rage, older than pride. It was a quiet knowing that no amount of "we didn't mean it" could fix what had already been shown, that sometimes the clearest truths are revealed not in what people say, but in what they so easily allow. And when he finally paused, waiting for my reaction, for warmth or forgiveness, or that same old softness he used to find in my eyes, all he saw was stillness. Not cold, just resolve. I invited him in, not to comfort him, but because I wasn't raised to close my door on family, even when they tried to close the door on me. He walked into my house, past the tools, the worn-out boots, the life he'd tried to keep in the garage, and I sat down in my chair, folded hands, and waited, because this time I wasn't the one who had explaining to do. He sat across from me, stiff in that expensive suit that suddenly looked too tight for the room. My living room wasn't grand. The wallpaper faded in places, the floor creaked near the window, and the clock on the wall had been ticking slightly off-beat for the last decade. But this room had seen more truth than any marble corridor in that estate of his. He shifted in the chair like it made him itch. Or maybe it wasn't the fabric. Maybe it was the memory of what he used to be in this house. A boy with scraped knees, wide eyes, and a head full of questions. A boy who used to run to me with every idea, every mistake, every dream. And now that boy was quiet. I looked at him long and steady. "This isn't about dinner," I finally said, my voice low and even. "It's not about whether I sat by the garden or in the garage. It's not about your staff forgetting my name, or calling me sir like I was a delivery man." He looked down, jaw tense, fingers clasped. "It's about what you've forgotten," I said. "About the roots beneath the estate, the foundation beneath the company, the hands that helped you walk straight when your father left, and the heart that taught you what it meant to stand tall without stepping on anyone." Still he said nothing. "You built something," I continued, "and I was proud of you. I still am. But somewhere along the way, you started thinking the walls were stronger than the people who laid the bricks. That titles made you important, and not the character behind them. You stopped looking back and started looking down." There was a pause, not the awkward kind, but the heavy kind, the kind that settles over a room like dust on untouched frames. "I taught you better," I said, more softly now. "I didn't just sign the first check. I taught you to value people before paper. But maybe you were listening more to the numbers than the lessons." He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He just sat there, a grown man who suddenly looked small again, because he knew, and the hardest part about knowing you've lost your way is realizing it was never taken from you. You simply let go. I looked toward the window where morning light was creeping in, casting long shadows on the floor between us. It reminded me of the distance time creates, not always in miles, but in memory. And for the first time that morning, I didn't feel angry. I felt tired, not weak, just done carrying the weight of someone else's forgetting. If he wanted to remember, he'd have to lift it himself. The document sat on the table between us, pristine and expectant. Thick ivory paper, crisp edges, inked names in perfect cursive, and a single blank space at the bottom right. The space where my signature used to go without question, without delay. But not this time. For the first time in years, decades even, I let the silence stretch. Not out of spite, but out of principle. The pen rested beside the paper, uncapped, ready, almost smug in its familiarity. He waited, not like a nephew waiting on family, but like a man watching a deal stall. And that was the problem, wasn't it? Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being an uncle. I had become a signature, a stamp of approval, a necessary but inconvenient name attached to legal threads he hadn't yet cut. "I won't sign," I said finally. Not loud, just clear. His eyes flickered. Shock, confusion, then calculation. Like he was trying to figure out how to rephrase, how to soften the moment, how to turn my no into a not yet. But I didn't budge. Because this wasn't about leverage, or power, or money. This was about something much older and much deeper. Respect, memory, dignity, and absence. That estate he built, with its vaulted ceilings, imported stone, and manicured vines, had everything but the one thing that made a home real. Legacy that remembers its roots. Without that, the walls were wide but hollow. The dining room echoed with laughter, but it lacked warmth. The garage where they placed me had more soul than the main hall, because that was the only place they didn't pretend. I looked at him, this man who once held my hand across the street, now looking like a stranger trying to close a deal. "You built a beautiful house," I said quietly, "but somewhere along the way you forgot to build a home." He looked away, because he knew I wasn't talking about architecture. He had lost something. Not in a storm, not in bankruptcy, but in forgetting the hands that steadied him when he was too young to see straight. And now that forgetfulness was catching up, not in shouts, but in silence. Not in broken windows, but in withheld ink. The deal wouldn't go through. The investors would ask questions. Deadlines would slip. And the only thing standing in the way of the empire was a man in a quiet house, with a clear memory. Not out of revenge, but to remind him. When you erase your story's beginning, the ending always falters. The estate didn't shake that night from wind or rain. It trembled under something heavier, the realization that paper and polish couldn't replace people, and that the signature you ignore might be the one that held it all together. The envelope was simple. No return address, no official seal. Just my name, written in slightly shaky penmanship, the way someone writes when they're still learning to trust their own voice. I almost mistook it for junk mail. Almost. But something about the weight of it, not physical but emotional, made me sit down before opening it. Inside was a folded sheet of lined paper, torn from a school notebook. And at the top, in neat blue ink, was a name I hadn't expected. It wasn't from my nephew. It was from his son, the boy who had barely looked my way that night, who had laughed with the others on the terrace, plate in hand, unaware that his great-uncle was eating alone near a lawnmower and a rusted toolbox. The boy who hadn't said a word when I left, who had watched but hadn't spoken, until now. I unfolded the paper slowly, reading every word like it might disappear if I blinked too hard. "Dear Uncle Walter, I know I didn't talk to you that night. I didn't even say hi. I saw you in the garage. I saw how no one sat with you. I saw how Dad didn't even look at you, and I didn't understand it until later. I heard the argument he had with Mom after you left. He said, 'Why should I apologize? He's just a signature.' I didn't know what he meant then, but I looked it up. I asked Mom what that meant. She cried. Then she showed me the papers in the drawer. 'You're the reason he even has that house. You're the reason we even have the school I go to. And he put you in the garage. Oh, I'm sorry. I just want you to know, I don't think like him. I don't want to be like him. I want to be like you.' I paused, the words blurring as tears welled in my eyes, not because of pain, but because something had shifted. Not in courtrooms, not in business meetings, but in the quiet heart of a boy who had seen injustice and refused to let it become normal. I kept reading. Well, I hope one day when I build something, you'll sit at the head of my table, not in the garage. I'll make sure there's always a seat for you. Thank you for showing me what dignity looks like. No signature, just Jacob. I sat back, letting the letter rest against my chest, feeling its truth beat gently with my own. He was young, but not too young to see, and not too young to choose differently. In all the noise of business, contracts, titles, and glassware, one quiet voice had found me, and it was louder than any boardroom applause, any investor's handshake, any flattery that came too late. That seat in the garage, it wasn't a humiliation. It was a mirror, and while the men in suits had seen a forgotten relative, the boy had seen something else, a foundation, a warning, a compass, and maybe a future he could build better. I folded the letter, slid it gently into the drawer beside my chair, and smiled, because I had just been offered the one seat that mattered most. He didn't announce it with press releases. There were no meetings, no late-night phone calls to justify or explain, just a visit to his lawyer on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The sky was quiet that day, as if the world itself had taken a breath, ready to listen. Walter Grayson sat with his back straight, wearing the same coat he had worn to that dinner in the garage. It still smelled faintly of old wood and engine oil, and he didn't care. It was part of him, just like the calluses on his hands, and the silence he had chosen over applause for most of his life. "I'd like to make a change to my will," he said calmly, handing over a single sheet of paper. It wasn't complicated. No trusts, no loopholes, no room for negotiations. Every share, every holding, every part of his quiet empire, to the children of laborers, to scholarship funds, to young people who were told they didn't belong at the table, the same way he once had been. A foundation in his name, but not about him. It would carry forward the values he once taught with a pencil behind his ear, a clipboard in hand, and a heart too stubborn to stop believing in hard work. It wouldn't build monuments. It would build lives. And not a single dollar would go to the estate on the hill. He walked home in the drizzle, the old gravel crunching beneath his feet, slower than before, but each step certain, the kind of certainty that comes not from victory but from clarity. The next morning he watched the sun rise from the wooden chair on his porch. No cars pulled into his driveway, no relatives called to argue, and that was fine, because he finally understood what legacy really meant. Not the kind they etch into stone above iron gates, not the kind listed in the footnotes of company histories, and certainly not the kind bought with signatures forced from guilt or obligation, but the kind passed silently, through example. The kind that speaks through empty chairs that were never meant to be empty, through young eyes that watched and remembered, through the moment a child chooses to do better than those before them. Walter didn't leave with fanfare. He left quietly, the same way he had lived, with his head held high and his name intact, not because the world gave him a title, but because he refused to trade his dignities for a place at someone else's table. And in doing so, he set his own. Long after his photo faded and the garage was repainted, somewhere, a kid with a backpack full of dreams would walk through a school's front door, paid for by a man they never met, a man who was told to eat in the garage, but instead chose to feed generations. And that was the seat Walter Grayson took in the end, the one that could never be taken from him.